Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Airlock, and this is another talk on philosophy, logic, and Thomas Aquinas, the most celebrated logician of the Catholic Church and much of medieval Europe. Although there's many cultures of all of that. I need to put this under an Italia tab Tablisi on my website. So, Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 to 1274 CE, was born in the family castle of Roccasecca. I don't believe that's where Roccaware comes from, kids. Between Rome and Naples. Napoleon, hence. Minor nobles of the house of the Counts of Aquino. I do not believe Count of Aquino is a brand of water yet. European castles are based on Persian kessels, by the way, quite literally in Iberia. And Italians got castles from Persian and Islamic lands, and all the backs and forths of all that, where they got much of their Neoplatonism and the latest in Aristotelian logic, particularly the commentaries and studies of Avicenna and Averroes, which Aquinas was more influential than any at popularizing in Europe and in the Catholic Church, which was the major Christian game and a whole lot of a cultural institution in town for many of the towns in Europe. So, yes, there is a painting, Gozzoli's, I hope I'm saying that right, his classic painting of Aquinas of 1471, putting Aristotle on the inferior left, Plato on the superior right side, and Averroes is lying at Aquinas' feet, as if the Islamic enemy of Christianity has been defeated by basically the Averroist logician and thus Aristotelian logician of the Catholic Church, who is kind of the Averroist of the Catholic Church. But of course he's defeating that, so he's come past it. And like all these thinkers, was not simply reiterating or rehashing what others had said. At 6 years old, Thomas, the youngest son of nobles, was given as an offering, here's a child, free baby, given as an offering to the church, specifically the Benedictines, and even more specifically the Abbey of Monte Cassino, which isn't anywhere near Vegas, such that their youngest son would one day be a powerful abbot, which would have made Aquinas the abbot of Monte Cassino, somewhat like the famous Count of Cristo Mountain. Hey, Abad, I hate that guy, from the Mel Brooks routine. Again, Robin Hood, Men in Tights. Unfortunately, for his folks, Aquinas wasn't interested in worldly power, as an abbot of otherworldly things or not, but rather ideal universals found in philosophy, theology, and logic, which likely made his family name far more famous than his family had hoped for. Think about if he had been a count, you never, of course, if you're Italian, know your own history, you would have heard of him. But if he had not become a logician, again, Aquinas would not be the name he is if he just was a count somewheres. Aquinas was taught to read and write in Latin, particularly to read the Latin author Augustine, Gesundheit, the original Christian Neoplatonist. I have heard it said both ways a bunch. The original Christian Neoplatonist of Augustine, like Al-Kindi, was for Islamic philosophy, then Al-Farabi was the very major Aristotelian. I still have to make a video, I believe, on Al-Kindi. Like Al-Farabi and Avicenna, Augustine was a committed Neoplatonist and quite committed to the logic of Aristotle's Organon. I've been talking a lot about that lately. But unlike Farabi, Avicenna, and Islamic philosophy, Augustine followed Averroes, and Europe followed Augustine. Greek and Arabic philosophy were catching on in Palermo, Salerno, and Naples, separate city-state principalities of Italy that were not united entirely, such that Renaissance Italians, again, would more have been, I am a Florentine. This is another Mel Brooks routine. You know how to make a Venetian blind, kapow. As there would be a Venetian, like the blinds, there would be, who would lead themselves, I suppose, because it's not unified, right? So, Napolitanos, right. I'm going to move on now. But with all of this, having continuous warfare between these different states, allegiances, and intermarriages with other European powers, like the game of pointy chairs, Aquinas was sent to Naples in 1239 at the age of 14 to study Aristotle, Averroes, and probably Maimonides, though anti-Semitism Aquinas shared with the church in Naples was quite quiet about that. What you will notice here, actually, Averroes gets in that painting. But Maimonides and Averroes would both be huge influences on Aquinas, but of course he gets billed as the Christian guy, and then all the rest are some other thing entirely if we know them at all. I have to say, of course, and as a quick aside, and beyond your political beliefs and whether or not you think you identify with mine or not, or who, or whom, I would say, of course, it is very important for people to understand that we really only see part of the history of the world, not because we can't read more and learn more, but because actually, in certain ways, there are still large cultural groups that people identify with or don't, and that affects how people do or don't tell history, and it still does. So in a certain way, I would say Averroes is often not even in spell check, and Ibn Rushd isn't, either word. So often, again, you would even think Ibn would be, or is even, yes, I will get off that. But it is, again, with all of these, Maimonides and Averroes were clearly influencing Aquinas. Many people will know Aquinas, and perhaps his name will be in a spell check or two, and such that you don't really need to check it over or right-click it. So with all of that in this current day, but back in the day here, we're going to get on to Aquinas' medieval pre-modern life. So Aquinas met and became a Dominican to further his studies, but his parents, who weren't happy about Aquinas majoring in theology and philosophy, had him kidnapped and imprisoned in the family castle for over a year. There is one questionable story popularly told, and I always have to tell it. I find it hilarious. I told a friend the other day. Is that his family did not want him to be an academic or some kind of philosophy person or so much of a priest or authority. And so they wanted him to be an abbot of some kind of more physical thing. This is also how religion was not simply a physical or otherworldly thing entirely in its practices, quite comprehensive and overlapping. So the family locks him in a prison tower, and supposedly, according to the story, with a prostitute who was going to somehow discourage him in ways I won't describe from being a priest. But Aquinas supposedly drove her away with a flaming log from the fire, which probably constitutes some kind of assault. Or at least, it could get some sort of restraint put against you. And then he collapsed, after which two angels girdled him with a cord that removed all sexual temptation from him, which the angels told him no man can obtain except by God's grace, not man's own efforts, which is actually, I've added to the story. I used to just tell the thing, well, they locked him in a tower with a prostitute, and then he drove her away. I'm not sure if they locked him in, how he got her out, but that's Rapunzel or otherwise. With all of this, again, I've added to it because I actually looked it up, and again, there's quite a theological context going on. And anyway, this also somehow dovetails with Taoists saying you can have sex and live to be 200, or you cannot have sex with anyone and become a true wizard somehow. But we won't talk about that, or people online having similar discussions. So, of Isaac Newton and otherwise. I am impressed he could wield a flaming log with such chaste hands. Yes, again, not calloused at all. So over 100 years before, the logician Abelard of Paris was castrated, all of this, for getting his student and boss's daughter Heloise pregnant and shipping her off to a convent for safekeeping, to a nunnery, which is somewhat the opposite of Aquinas' problem. Yes, that's actually, you get, right. So both spurned sex for logic ultimately, not originally both, though unintentionally on Abelard's part, as well as the rest of him, which remained. Aquinas' family finally saw the scholastic light and sent him to Paris to study with Abelard the Great. Misspeak. Albert. Just Albert, not Abelard. That's a different guy. Albert, I was reading quickly. The Great, who gave him Pseudo-Dionysius, fake Dennis, to study. The Neoplatonist Dionysius argued that the mind works dialectically, back and forth, with positives and negatives through belief and doubt. I studied this stuff in grad school. I did not hear of it before that. To come to a greater vision of the angelic and demonic forces of the cosmos, both psychology and angelology. This is, again, science and logic and religion are all very much still one and the same thing, with different branches, etc., as was talking about, be a local abbot versus be a more abstract, scholarly sort of monk, I believe. So Aquinas earned his master's in theology in 1256, the year after the Pope lifted the prohibition on teaching and studying Aristotle in Paris, convenient timing, which many Parisians were doing anyways through the Arabic works and translations of Avicenna and Averroes into Latin, hence their Latinized names. In Aquinas' early Paris writings, which show more influence by Avicenna, he argued for Catholic theological doctrines such as the Trinity in terms of Aristotelian and Islamic logic. He wrote commentaries. He would not say, this is Islamic logic right here, Christians, but yes. He wrote commentaries on the Bible, Boethius and Lombard. Those are him putting it in the Christian context. Taught students in the morning and debated scholars in front of students in the afternoon for 3 hours a day about truth, knowledge, and theology. Aquinas wrote many commentaries on Aristotle, like Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes before him, which would make him an excellent commentator. Regardless of what the Pope, Il Papa, the big potato or tater, an uncommentator, would say. There is a terrible joke about that a potato comes home from college and says, I want to marry Peter Jennings, and her father says, you're finally bred, I won't have you marry a commentator, which of course sounds kind of racist. But onward from racist potato jokes. So in 1265, Aquinas was sent to Rome to found a special school and teach much as he liked for the Dominican order. Aquinas is still the crown jewel of the Dominicans and Catholic philosophy, second only to Augustine, Gesundheit, himself, whom Aquinas quotes more than anyone, trying to base this in Catholic philosophy. So essentially, it wasn't that the Middle Ages had no science or no philosophy, no art, what have yous, and it was that Europeans did not have the money and power they acquired between 1600 and 1700 over the Islamic world. And Aquinas is very much the guy who is bringing in Aristotle after Augustine did Plato and saying, hey, we have to build on the work of the Catholics and the Muslims, but also the Christians and the Catholics and Boethius and all of this. And he is making this solidly Aristotelian, what was already Neoplatonic, just as we see in the Islamic world. And the basics of that we have already covered under Aristotle, so you know what they are studying if you watch my Aristotle and listen to that. You can watch and listen at the same time even. So, central to Aquinas' theology is the Aristotelian concept of sub-alternation. I was mentioning, I think that actually the looking glass shows that twice because you find the kings following the queens, but that's another whole thing. If we know something that is completely true or not true, all or none on the top of the square of opposition, we necessarily know something else is true, what is directly beneath what we know on the square, such that if all A is B, then we also know some A is B. In fact, this is counterintuitive, because if I know all cows are good, I know some cows are good because I know they're all good. Why would I say it that way? I like the Wittgensteinian point, we wouldn't. So in a certain sense, some A is B is almost deceptively untrue. And I would say if I knew all cows are good and I said some cows are good, that's actually deceptively untrue. But according to strict subalternation, if I know all A is B, and we understand this also, I know some A is B is also true. But of course, and if I said it some A is B instead of all A is B, it could be considered false by many, debatedly, yes? Yeah. So if we know, though, following this strict subalternation kind of move, if we know all A is B, and thus we know some A is B, which is the bottom of the square of opposition being true if the top is true for Aristotle, as Boethius and others put it, and if we know no A is B, thus, we also know some A is not B. If I know no cows are good, I also know some cows are not good. But again, that suffers from the same problem as before. It's odd to say it that way. Now, it's perfectly fine if you know some cows are not good, maybe none are, but why would you imply subalternation the other way around if you know the first? If you know the former, which is the subalternation here, if you know all or none, why does knowing some or some not apply at all? It almost seems useless. But this is a strict rule of Aristotelian logic. Again, before Wittgenstein, trying to put logic into strict formulae don't entirely work, but do work plenty. And it's amazing to study. So this is often completely useless, again, in daily life, as we certainly know that some elephants are nice if we are certain that all of them are, and certainly know that some reptiles don't brush their teeth if none of them do, and all this goes without saying. In context, if I know that all A are B and I tell you some A are B, I could even be accused of lying, of not telling the full truth, even if, according to Aristotle, what we said is necessarily and entirely true. In the context of abstract Aristotelian logic and the square of opposition. This is the kind of thing where I think people need to be more aware of how logic and truth are used, and I can talk, in the modern era, where if I am a modern lawyer and I'm fully logical and adverbial, arboreal, not entirely, spend my time on the ground, down with the people, that I can tell you some of this is true, knowing all is true, and I can be deceptive and say, but I'm not liable because I meant it. And I said, and you hear people quote rules of logic to justify their silly deceptions all the time in these kind of ways. Oh, but subalternation means what I meant is true. Yeah. In context, the average person would judge otherwise, yes? And let's leave that example right there, simply, that the average person would say this feels weird to say that it's necessarily true what you said rather than you lead people well into what you mean or understand, because many would find that deceitful. So you understand. So subalternation is, though, understandable. We do get how the math, how the summation of it works the other way around. It, again, I have to insist, though, it's really working sum to all or sum not to none, really, that makes more of the intuitive sense. But all that is interactive, actually, as a person knowing a bunch about how if then works would say. So Aquinas, with all of this, I've fallen from the notes for a second. It was very useful to Aristotle and Aquinas to believe in subalternation, as intelligence itself, though, is more absolute and above, and then comes downward such that we know some and some not to a degree. And then if we are mortal beings, and then we always know some math is true, some math is true, some math is true, again, ascending that kind of, well, we may as well assume I can be all true about this if some. And when is that? The answer, my friend, is blowing somewhere in the wind and the spirit, and I feel it moving amongst us this evening. So with all of that, and not to mock anybody's beliefs at all, but humanity still has problems putting their finger on all of this after all of this time. So doing logic in the name of the spirit, God, science, polytheism, monotheism, atheism, everything, and it's very similar to human thinking. Humanity is subaltern to God, in a sense thus, some and not to the big all, somewhat God but also fallen man, cursed by the acts of Adam and Eve, and thus fallen from grace. The use of logic would surprise many Aristotelian-minded scholars who would identify Greek thought again with more modernity and secularization. Now, Aquinas followed Averroes more than most. Aquinas' fellow theologians accused him of Aristotelian heresy, not apparently a Averroistic heresy, because that wouldn't be Christian of him, would it? To be a heretic that way, yes? It wouldn't be inhuman or heretical of him as a Christian. A Muslim can't be heretically Christian in the same way, I guess they're already a heretic. They can't be heretically Christian, though. He accused others of following Averroes rather than Aristotle and the Catholic Church, he himself. He also, in spite of being the primary Christian or Aristotelian, sides with Plato and Neoplatonists against Aristotle and the Peripatetics in many places, which shows you that he was not simply the Aristotelian versus the Platonist, particularly where Plato suggests the one is beyond any particular substance. I do like all these usually great thinkers that are revered are not just one leading from A to B, it's a whole network of their thinking about different figures of the time. So Aquinas, like the Muslim commentators he read, focused on the logic, metaphysics, psychology, and ethics of Plato and Aristotle that they had at the time. Much like Islamic philosophers, Aquinas argued that the soul is the source of the body, the immaterial, the true essence and nature of the physical, even though Aristotle's unmoved mover was, I think, quite physical. And in fact, I have gotten into arguments with people. It is not clear how much an immaterialist Plato is, where he does say the immaterial, again, it might be crossing over with other things that are the less material of the material in ways. But like fire, air, the higher of things. But that actually gets us into the Plato. So while Aristotle clearly argues that greater substances are above, Aquinas, like Avicenna and Averroes, argues there are potencies, which are superior to substance and the material, which Plato doesn't technically say, but that would be something like the Ideas above us, which may be made of superior fires. In the Renaissance painting by the Catholic Raphael, The School of Athens, Plato points upward to the heavens above, and Aristotle points downward to the world below. So Raphael, like Aquinas but not Aristotle, thought Plato was arguing for the immaterial above. You often find people thinking Plato in the Christian world of Raphael, and then amongst some Muslims, of course, you would find them thinking Plato is an immaterialist, more like saying God is not made of any physical elements and isn't physically a being entirely, although, of course, putting your feet down here is questionable. As I do like to mention, apparently there are interwoven texts of Genesis. Some say God has feet, stomps through the Garden of Eden. Other sources don't mention God having feet. Does God have physical feet or not? Is more sort of polytheistic to monotheistic in ancient world cultural terms, without saying anything else about all of that. But in the evolution of these things, again, God and the thing, truth itself, I must say, is some kind of immaterial, formal, abstract thing in the Christian and Islamic world. I think all the time about how the more material we have become and the more mechanical, in certain ways, the more idealist and metaphysical we have become. And you see some of that here, although you are welcome to think about that more here, and I won't marshal your thinking or try to put it into an idea or two up in the superior fires of the cosmos here for you or I. So Aquinas argues that speculative reasoning and practical reasoning, the mental abstractions and physical practices, notice again the dichotomies, these are there in the Greek thinking, but again this is more increasingly medieval and then modern, pre-modern times. That mental abstractions and physical practices of thinking are different, the same powers in us but employed in different ways. Speculative reason grasps truth in itself. For Aquinas, the four perfect forms of Aristotle's syllogisms, that it's formal somehow, while practical reasoning grasps things for other ends. Elizabeth Anscombe, one of Wittgenstein's most prized students, the one he trusted to edit his most important thoughts, along with others, but centrally, as what we now call the philosophical investigations, used the metaphor of someone shopping who is followed by a detective, both who keep lists, the detective and the shopper of what to buy, and the detective of what mistakes the shopper makes, such as buying the wrong kind of butter. The shopper is judged on what mistakes are made on the list, and made in what is bought and brought home, but the detective, more abstract and practical, is judged only on the mistakes in the list, nothing else. Again, very ideal and formal. Of office. Like speculative reason is only concerned with truth, like concern with mistakes themselves rather than bringing home the butter. Wittgenstein wrote in the Philosophical Investigations that we strangely say meaning is a mental act, but we would not say rising butter prices are an act of butter, but rather a relationship in the situation as the whole. And I do think that Anscombe is certainly on to something plenty in the interactions of our mind and world and life. I would also point out here, as I do with the Wittgenstein, that it isn't just that we can reduce everything to the method of the detective, but perhaps that is what Anscombe is thinking, and I think that Wittgenstein would worry a tiny bit here, but I will leave that where that is. So that said, though, you have that the shopper is definitely practical reasoning in daily life, and then you have higher levels of mind with Plato and Aristotle and others. And those higher levels of intellect, as for the Christian and Islamic and other thinkers, Jewish Maimonides and others, that with those higher centers of life and fire and light in the psychology and cameras and levels of the mind, somewhat the Kundalini Yoga, is that you would be able to see the form of mistakes and truth rather than simply material instances of it itself. Now, this is what's going to lead to, ultimately, thinking like early Wittgenstein's truth tables, and I've been helping folks with that lately. And yet, I think that later Wittgenstein is better because he saw the limitations of such simple forms, even though it is almost always simple overlapping various forms much like these. And that is where I will leave Aquinas. And again, Wittgenstein actually doesn't open the investigations with Aquinas, but a quote from Augustine. So yes, much happiness. Actually, that would be Anscombe and Wittgenstein somewhat together opening it that way, but again, I've given those talks. Happiness. Hopefully, again, please give me kind comments in the questions. Please watch my other videos. I will be slowly getting everything into chaptered, more legible content here. And I will see you, as always, if I ever see you.